Okay, let's hand over to Richard.
Okay, good evening all. I've been communicating back and forth with John for some months now, but this is the first time we've seen each other almost face to face. John describes himself amazingly as a hobbyist beekeeper, which I find very amusing because he's written a book. Is it just one book, John, or more than one book?
No, just the one, and it's a very small book as well. So.
Well, I'm still writing a book, so that sounds pretty serious to me. But John says he likes to experiment with different methods of beekeeping, particularly around chemical-free beekeeping. Been beekeeping for 12 years and 11 years now without the use of any chemicals at all. Checkerboarding, I have to say, until I started speaking to John, I'd never heard of checkerboarding. It's a fascinating method of avoiding swarming, which I have to say would be very welcome for a lot of us, I think, without intervening in the brood, which I find quite amazing. There's only a small minority of beekeepers in the UK. For the past 4 years, John, have been using checkerboarding.
Yeah.
But the USA, people in the USA have been using it for 25 years.
Yeah.
Which is, and it is a truly low intervention form of beekeeping, which, given my beekeeping skills, they're low intervention by default, I have to say. So, John says, unlike most things, it sounds too good to be true, but this works. He's had no swarm cells for the last 4 years, and it's simple and effective. So I'm not going to try and describe it anymore from John's notes. I'll let John do that. So over to you, John, if we may.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Ian, and thank you, all of you members of Cheltenham Gloucester, for giving up your time and listening to this. So yeah, so Richard summed up me, so we can get on to the checkerboarding. And I find beekeeping is just an absolutely amazing craft. And for many of us, the whole issue, I would say, but for many of us, the whole issue of swarming and everything that entails is challenging, to say the least. The whole issue around neighbours knocking on the door, saying your bees have swarmed, the number of swarm inspections, the impact that swarming and all those inspections have on the colony, or the mitigation measures. The list is long when it comes to swarming. And so 4 years ago, in fact, I had what I would describe as just a colony which was so difficult. I think in that season they swarmed 6 or 7 times. Every so often you get a queen whose genetics are a bit wonky, and they just swarmed and swarmed and swarmed, and I just got absolutely fed up with it. And so we went looking for something, a silver bullet that would put an end to this constant shinning up ladders or all the other mitigation measures we had to take. So 3 years ago, we began experimenting with a little known method of swarm prevention called checkerboarding. And we believe that, based on our experience to date, that this really does work. So I'll share my screen. With a bit of luck, you should see hopefully what I'm seeing. So does that work? Yeah, great. Okay, so that's just the opening screen, yeah, which you know. So what is checkerboarding? Checkerboarding involves taking a box of stores above the brood nest and merging it with a box of drawn empty combs, so that the 2 boxes alternate with the frames of honey, frame of drawn comb, and hence this concept called checkerboarding. You end up with this American expression, checkerboarding, checkers, these alternating vertically and horizontally. Something you only need to do a single time, and in doing it, you're actually breaking up that store, the honey reserve that are above the bees. And the kind of 3 really key elements to it are timing, when you do it, stores, this manipulation of the stores into between alternating drawn empty comb, and in the late spring and summer, giving the bees plenty of space And that really, in an absolute nutshell, is it. That is how to do checkerboarding. So we're going to go on now, and I'm going to talk fairly lightly about how to do checkerboarding. I won't go into all the aspects of honeybee behavior and why this is happening, but we'll touch on it lightly. So where did this idea come from? Well, I think it came from an extraordinary American beekeeper, a gentleman called Walter Wright. He's passed away in 2016, and in my opinion, this chap Walter Wright, I think he was, absolutely out there on a limb. He was like, his understanding of honeybee behavior, especially around the whole act of swarming, reproduction, and survival, I think was phenomenal. And we're blessed with some amazing beekeepers, some amazing teachers, some incredible researchers. But Walter Wright, I think he was right out there on a limb and massively understated. So he began he spent all of his career as a troubleshooting NASA engineer. He took up beekeeping in his late 50s to supplement his pension, his income. And the thing I really like about Walter was he didn't have any mentors. He didn't join a beekeeping association. He didn't read any beekeeping books. When he began this wonderful craft that we're involved with beekeeping, when he began, he literally went back to his basic kind of understanding of how he approached his troubleshooting engineering career, and he just observed what happened with the bees. So he had multiple hives, and he just watched and tried to understand what was happening. And he very much viewed beekeeping as a troubleshooting exercise. And once he got his feet under the table and he had a good handle on what happened with bees and why, he then began to talk to local beekeepers. And he said, look, what's your biggest bugbear? What's the thing that bothers you most or troubles you most, or the thing that you can't resolve? And and most of the people came back and said, swarming. And he said, that's fine. He said, give me 3 years and I'll crack it. So he hadn't been working on swarming. He just had a fairly good, confident, he had a really good understanding of honeybee behavior that he could resolve it. And in his opinion, in his writings, he managed to resolve this within a couple of years. And I think that quote at the bottom there by Walter Wright kind of sums up, I think, I never spoke to him and I never met him, but I think it sums up his character. And he says, the fact that you'll find none of this information in your favorite books doesn't make this any less true. If you look for the effects in your hive, which is what he spent a lot of time doing, watching what happened and not intervening, you can confirm that the concepts are valid. And I think this last sentence where he says, of course, it's easier to just reject the concepts because they're new to you. And I've had many, many people, when I've spoken about what I've done with chemical-free beekeeping, when I've spoken about what I've done with checkerboarding, I've had lots of people say, if it's that good, why doesn't everybody do it? And I think a lot of the answer is in that last sentence. A lot of us, we do what we do and we do it successfully as far as we're concerned, and we're used to doing it. And actually to depart from that is sometimes quite challenging, I would suggest. So how does it work, checkerboarding? The key thing to checkerboarding is the bees' perception of the entirety of their hive and their stores. So what they see as their ceiling and the available stores changes. They want to have a solid block of stores before they swarm. So having checkerboarded, what we'll find is that the brood size increases dramatically. And once they get to what they consider to be the limit of their brood size, they will then go into full-on nectar production. And what that really means, Walter Wright coined this phrase, survival mode. They are solely concerned with survival. So when we talk about the bees building up nectar, they're really putting away stores for the winter to come. And this will start happening from late spring all through the summer. If the bees are successful, and by successful, I mean they start infilling all the available spaces with nectar, then they can revert to swarm preparation. So the trick is to stay ahead of the bees all the time. So this checkerboarding, it's really that last bullet point there, this checkerboarding, what it does is it changes the bees' the colony's objectives, that because we've managed to alter the understanding of what's available to them in terms of stores and space. So won't they swarm anyway? Well, based on everything that I've read from Walter Wright, if you follow his regime of checkerboarding principles faithfully, then it is entirely possible to get 100% success. And as I've already outlined these three tenets of timing. Timing is really important. So you have to do it in a timely fashion, well before let's just call it the swarm season. I'll go into the timing in a little bit more time, in a little more detail. The stores, how we manipulate the stores. I've already shown a brief example there of how we alternate the drawn empty comb and the stores. And then thereafter, it's all about giving the bees enough space. And that's really about managing the incoming nectar flow. And it really can make this thing a thing of the past, this whole business of swarming. So where's the evidence, or who has experienced it? Clearly Walter Wright. I think he had something like about 120 hives at one point, and he didn't have any swarms. He had, after he passed away, there's a chap called Rob Koss, and he kind of picked up the mantle with which Walter Wright had begun his teachings and carried on. All of Walter Wright's original writings and teaching, they're all freely available on the American journal Bee Source. And he wrote tomes and tomes on all kinds of aspects of beekeeping. He wrote about everything from the worthiness of drones in a colony, queen excluders, but he really kind of his swan song really was this whole concept of checkerboarding. And so there's masses and masses of freely available information that he wrote in its original form. And part of the reason that we took his work and condensed it down and presented it in a slightly different way is I always found his writings really difficult. I had to sit in a dark room with a flannel and read it and read it and read it again. But so there's plenty of information that Walter Wright's got to endorse his teachings and this method of checkerboarding. There's a gentleman called Charles Ilsley. It's freely available on YouTube, Northwest New Jersey Beekeeping Association. And as he says in his video, and it says effectively a video of an association meeting. And he said, you know, he used to spend his time in the spring with going up, shinning up ladders, catching 30 or 40 ladders. As soon as he began practicing checkerboarding, he never did that again. And that's an interesting video because it comes at checkerboarding from a slightly different angle. There's ourselves, the Pangbourne beekeepers. There are 4 of us who do it, and then I can cite a whole list of people through my contacts. I'm fortunate enough to work in one of the Thorns shop in Windsor, so I get to talk and meet an awful lot of beekeepers and commercial guys, and there are a lot of people I now know who are practicing this checkerboarding. And a favourite quote of mine is from a customer in the shop, Chris Farnham, who says that it's a hell of a lot easier. And I think that just really sums it up in terms of that whole kind of spring management issue around beekeeping. So timing is a critical aspect of checkerboarding and when to do it. So Walter Wright's original teachings, he spoke about what he called a swarm cutoff point. And he felt that this was about peak apple blossom time. And what this is, on this day, this period in the spring is when the honeybee behavior changes from making swarm preparations to staying put, staying within the colony. So those that have already begun their swarm preparation are clearly going to swarm, but there tends to be a peak point. And he used this as a fulcrum as to when to do his checkerboarding. And he counted back and he said, right, you know, the first warning of swarming is the appearance of drone cells. And then effectively you can start the clock ticking. And drone cell formation doesn't necessarily always happen in every colony, and not necessarily in every colony that that's going to swarm. But for the majority of them, 6 weeks later, you can expect the colony. Once you see the drone cells forming 6 weeks later, you can expect to see swarm cells and the swarm issuing. About 3 weeks after you see the drones forming, there's this amazing concept called backfilling, which I'll talk about a bit later on. And about two weeks later, swarm cells are started after this backfilling begins. And so Walter Wright felt that if you imagine, right, when is that swarm cutoff point, mid-apple blossom season, he felt that you needed to do this act of checkerboarding about 9 weeks prior to that, so sometime in early March. And when we got hold of Walter's stuff and we did this, first time we did it in February 2019, and we had that amazing 2-week period in February where we had, I think it was in low 20s. It was just phenomenal. And I thought, this is bliss. Well, get in there, do our checkerboarding. We did that. For some of them it worked, but for a couple of the colonies, 8 weeks later, they swarmed. And we just couldn't, we were crestfallen and we thought, what are we doing wrong? So thereafter, I think we came to the conclusion that what Walter Wright had done in his timings, being in the center of a big continental landmass, America, he had nice, clearly defined seasons. Ours jump around quite a bit. So the so-called mid-apple blossom season can vary by 1 or 2 weeks, each year, depending on what's happening. So to strip away the uncertainty, thereafter, we did it in December. So last month, we finished checkerboarding the majority of our colonies. And since we've been doing that, we have not had, as I say, we've not had a single swarm cell since then. So pre-Christmas, December, that's when we would typically checkerboard. So the preparation for swarming, preparation for checkerboarding needs to begin. You need to start thinking about that. If you really, really want to do it, you need to think about it probably in the summer and start thinking about, right, I'm going to need, for each colony, I'm going to need a box of honey. I'm going to need a box of drawn empty frames. So that kind of preparation needs to start happening in summer and autumn. So you can even orientate your feeding regime to acquire your drawn frames. So it needs a little bit of thought and preparation. So in December, that's when we would actually carry out our checkerboarding, and this could be done really quickly with a little bit of preparation. You get your 2 boxes with your frames ready, and you simply just decant the super that is above the brood, the super with the stores, and alternate the frames. And you can actually be done very quickly, especially if you've got a little bit of help. And there's a sort of pictorial example of what some of us have done in the past. So you can see here that the frames, the drawn comb and the stores are alternating laterally and vertically. So you've got this complete checkerboarding effect. So here's a sort of schematic. It's a bit like the one I showed at the beginning. So you've got a frame of a box of honey there, and you simply fractured it across 2 boxes, with the second box being drawn empty comb, and that's your checkerboarding done. So that's a very simple, basic example of how to checkerboard. Here's another example where you may not have a box of stores available, or you may have it on another hive, or you may have put it away in the shed or your bee shed over winter as storage for the checkerboarding, and then you can hoik it out, do your alternating. So you've done the alternating on the right, but on this occasion, and we've done this many times, you still want to hedge your bet. You still want that extra resource, that fondant block in there to support the bees through the winter. And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't affect the checkerboarding. I would just say 2 things here. If you're going to put fondant on, just do the regular thing, put your ambrosia or your hive alive or whatever. If you're going to put one of those great big slabs of fondant, that's going to impair the bees, because what we want to do by checkerboarding is early on give them the opportunity to get up into those frames. And, you know, they will do this over the winter. They will roam around, they'll explore, they'll realize that they haven't got that solid block. So we don't want to impair that. So if you are going to put your fondant, you'd put it above the brood box, no crown board, which I've put the NB, no crown board here. Shove your crown board on the top. So here's an example where you've used, say, a single brood, or people who keep, for example, their bees on double brood. You know, if you can get your bees into a single brood box, and you can do it, you can get away with doing it with a single brood box. So a standard national brood box, or you might have 14 by 12s, or a friend of mine in the chap I quoted, Chris, he uses Dadents. So you can use a single brood box, as long as it's you know, it's not a shallow box, not a super. So we think you can do that. We haven't done it enough to be completely convinced, but certainly friends of mine have done it with standard national, with 14 by 12s, and as I say, with a Dadent. So if that's maybe another option if you wanted to go that way. So what happens when we get into the spring and we get into the spring build-up? What we're going to find here is that the bees are going to expand rapidly. They'll come up through those checkerboarded frames, and the colonies will expand significantly. And it's really important here that we don't restrict the brood nest. So if you put a queen excluder on, or if you want to use a queen excluder, please don't do it at this point. You know, keep watching, keep looking, keep observing where that colony is. Once we get to the point where the brood nest has finished expanding and we're into nectar, incoming nectar, we're into the flow of honey, then at that point you might choose to put on a queen excluder if you've got particular honey supers, and you don't want brood in your honey frames. And Walter Wright described this concept of drying cells. So I'm sure some of you will have seen this, that as the brood nest is expanding, there's this rim of cells that are drying out. The cells that were previously filled with nectar, they're drying out. They dried them out, getting them ready basically to lay in as the brood nest expands. If we see this drying cells start to become infilled, then we know that they're actually starting to make swarm preparations. This was one of our, so this is actually a schematic of one of our colonies, the first colonies, and we've long since, you know, found a way of managing these colonies so that we don't have these skyscrapers. But for most colonies, you know, there's a requirement for drones. There's absolutely is a requirement for drones. And what we did initially, we didn't have a queen excluder. We had these lovely big colonies. We had lots of nectar management. I had a lovely suite of manly frames, big frames with honey for honey. And then, of course, interestingly enough, they got hold of the queen, marched her across a so-called honey barrier, laid up the drone requirement up in the supers, and then took her back down and carried on. So we learned a bit of an interesting lesson there. Two things that we do differently now is we try and make some provision for drones. So we probably add a frame each side of each brood box and just put drone cell in there, so they've got that option. And also now, you know, we're confident enough with what's happening that we would probably, once we get to this kind of configuration where we know that the nectar's incoming, the brood has finished expanding, we'd probably add a queen excluder and just both separate our honey frames and also to make sure the queen doesn't go walkabout. And so these colonies, these are the first year we did this. So apart from the one that swarmed, you know, the non-swarming checkerboarded colonies were huge like this. So we were literally week by week, because we knew the theory, we'd read what Walter Wright had said, we didn't know what was happening. We were literally going through these colonies frame by frame, each one of them, just to satisfy ourselves that it would work, just to show and to give us some evidence to support what he was saying. And so some of these inspections would take an hour and a half. So we went through and mapped them all to satisfy ourselves that this really was working, and we believed it. Yeah, we could see that it was happening as he described. So what Walter Wright did after a while was he moved away from this sort of catchy phrase checkerboarding, and he started calling this whole kind of swarm prevention method nectar management, because actually that's all we were doing. Once you've done the initial checkerboarding, all you're concerned about is how to manage the nectar. And again, this is early on in our early days. You know, we were shinning up ladders. Can you imagine it? I mean, if that isn't an accident waiting to happen, somebody on the ground there passing a super down, you know, the possibilities are endless for disaster. And so, but we were at this stage, we were still following Walter's basic principles and not mucking around with it. And so, but we kind of learned, and we began to take off the honey a lot earlier, or even if we weren't extracting, we would be depositing, clearing the bees and just using a non-checkerboarded colony for storage, so that we just did a single extraction. So there's, you know, we don't go up ladders anymore. I'm grateful to say. So there's a picture of Walter Wright with one of his towers. So what are the benefits? The benefits, we believe, are fewer inspections. There's no need to go into the brood. You don't need to be worried about swarm cells, or the bees that the bees are going to swarm. And we've seen the evidence of that with our own eyes and through our own experience. There's a really nice spin-off that the bees will supersede. So they're laying at phenomenal rates at sometimes, you know, when there's a good flow, unlike last year, when there's a good flow and all is well. I think we worked it out at one stage that she was laying at something like a rate of 4,000 eggs a day. So we've all heard about queens that lay 1,000 or 1,500, but we actually did the maths on this, and we reckoned she was laying at 4,000 a day, not sustainable. So what they do, because we've done the checkerboarding and because we've changed their perception of stores, available space, and continued with the space and stayed ahead of the bees, they will never feel they have enough to swarm. But what they'll do is they'll supersede. So you literally get this 1-for-1. You don't get any swarming, and what a nice problem that is. You end up with lots more honey. The drawbacks, you know, you just have to think a little bit about what you've got these hives on. So we made sure, you know, whatever we had underneath was solid and low down. Might need a bit of help initially, you know, if your boxes are at head height and you know, handling heavy supers are always heavy at the best of times, but so you might need some assistance. You certainly might need more equipment. If we have a good year and we have lots of honey, then you might need, you know, wonderful problem to have. You might need to buy some more supers. And the last one, you know, I'll say that tongue in cheek, but you might need more outlets to sell your honey. So if any of the aforementioned is not for you, I think this gem from Walter Wright is just an absolute diamond, really. It's this concept that he called backfilling, and what he described here. So what that graphic there shows a colony that's not been checkerboarded. There they are in the winter on the left. We get into the spring and the summer. The brood is expanding. They get up to a point where they think, right, we've got a full reserve, a full block of honey above us. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually begin swarm preparation. And what they do as a part of swarm preparation is they actually start to reduce down the volume. So we all know, as part of swarm preparation, we know the queen's slimmed down, she reduces laying. Very rarely does she stop laying, despite what we're told. But what they do, the bees do, is they recognize that if they're going to lose a third to a half of their bees, they cannot support that same volume of brood being laid up. They simply haven't got the bees to do it. So what they do is they literally backfill it with nectar. And, you know, for 8 years, I did beekeeping, and when you go and do an inspection, there's so much going on, and there's so much stuff that you didn't realize is going on, and your head's full of stuff, and plus you've got the added hazard of the bees. And I found that it was only when I read about this and began looking for it that we began to see it. So they will reduce down the brood nest by infilling it with nectar. So if you see your brood nest starting to fill from the top down, the area of the brood. 2 weeks later, sure enough, you're going to see swarm cells, and we found that a wonderful thing to see. And we managed to get some evidence by, there's a picture on the left of it's a shallow frame, I think it is, yeah. And you can just sort of see the glistening nectar where they started infilling the brood nest. And sure enough, this colony, a couple of weeks later, swarmed. And I can't remember why we took this photo. We weren't looking for backfilling. We were just trying to map what was going on. And when we realized they swarmed and then went back to this, we thought, blimey, yes, there is something in what this chap Walter Wright says. That's a shameless plug on this book that we've written. And I'll just finish off with some pictures. So these are some pictures of Walter Wright's hives. The chap bottom right is a chap called Rob Koss, who carried on with this concept of checkerboarding after Walter Wright passed. And as I said, looking at those two pictures, especially at the top, we don't advocate that because it's just too much to have tower blocks like that. This is us in 2020. So my co-author on the right, Anita. So this is before we've kind of realized they don't all have to be skyscrapers. That's my colleague in the middle. That's my colleague Jill on the left with her single colony. And on the right, that's my apiary with the two colonies, the black hive and the purple hive, but on the background, the two tall ones, two colonies that I checkerboarded. And the black hive, that's the queen where I'd initially had 6 or 7 swarms. And for me, that hive, if that hive didn't swarm, for me, that was the, that eureka moment that there might be something in this. So I was mighty pleased that she didn't, same queen, she didn't swarm. These are my colonies back in May of last year, and I'm pretty much a devotee to this now. So I do it because I just don't want the grief of catching swarms. I picked up 5-6 swarms from my, if we could, we can't, but if we could pan right, my next door neighbor on the allotments is a good friend of mine, and he's got 5 colonies. He checkerboarded them all, they all swarmed. And so I went and picked up all 5 of his swarms from all over the place, and I had a slight anxiety attack. I thought, maybe this thing just isn't working. So I had to go through every one of these buggers, satisfy myself I had my original queens. Then I went to my friend Mark's, and sure enough, what I should have done is started with his, because what he'd done, Mark, he put queen excluders. The brood was bursting out of his hives, and even as I stood there looking at one of his colonies, they swarmed. So it's all about not restraining that brood nest if you want this to work. And that's my email, and it's not for everyone I know to ask questions, but I'm very approachable. So I think at this point, that's probably enough of listening to me. I'll hand over back to Ian and Richard and see where we go.
John, thank you. Thank you. Right then, yes, we have had some questions come in. Some of them got answered as we went along, so I might ask them again just so they're covered.
Sure.
And then if anybody has any extra questions, if you do the virtual hand up thing and or put it in the chat box, and yeah, they're still coming in, so that's good. So if I just start from the beginning. Okay, you covered this one near the end there, which was there's the genetic element of swarming reproduction versus requeening, new queens, supersedures. You've kind of explained there that you rely on superseding. So is that your queen replacement, queen rearing, you're selecting for that technique?
Yeah, and what I tend to do is I tend to take my best colony that's checkerboarded, and then I use that, because we all know for a queen rearing, one of the basic things you need is a super colony packed with bees, packed with resources. And because we end up with these monsters, I tend to use my best colony for queen rearing. And so, you know, if everybody just did this checkerboarding, which of course not everyone is going to, but if everyone did, you wouldn't get that kind of genetic diversity. So we know that not everyone's going to do it, and even amongst ourselves, we don't all do it on every colony. So there has to be some free reign in order to get that kind of spreading. But yeah, so it's, you know, it's a means to an end for us, the beekeepers, the checkerboarding. And away from that, I'll probably have 1 or 2 colonies I don't checkerboard, either for queen rearing and or for honey storage from the checkerboarded hives.
Okay, cool, thank you. Malcolm asked a question, which I think you've answered both. One is, assume you do not need fondant, but then I think a couple of slides after that, you showed a slide where, yes, you can use fondant. It's just a question of where you put it.
Yeah.
And the other one was, where is the queen excluder? And you've kind of answered that as well, which, do you just want to cover that off?
Yeah, so generally I would say, you know, if you can possibly bear it, don't use one. I never use one. I never used to use one. Occasionally I use one. But if you are going to use a queen excluder, you've just got to wait. You must wait until you get, you can see an obvious flow. Once you can see nectar coming in, the brood nest has finished expanding, then you can put a queen excluder on. And you know, it's quite straightforward to check. You're not doing a detailed inspection. You can just crack the boxes, do a tilt test. You can even, you know, if you're strong enough, you can go 2 boxes down, do a tilt test. You can see the extent of the brood. A tilt test, so you're just lifting up one side of the box. You can see the extent of the brood. Once you're happy that the brood nest has stopped and there's nectar coming in, I'd probably give them a super in addition to allow for contingency, then put a queen excluder on, and then do what you like.
I suppose the other way of looking at it is, as you say, once you've built your stack, as you see the brood box going down, yeah, you can sort of put your queen excluder halfway up your stack if you like, so that you can then start taking them off the top. Is that what you do, or do you just not bother with the queen excluder at all?
Personally, I tend not to worry about it myself. I don't worry about it, you know, and I know all the reasons why a lot of people do have a queen excluder, and I find that quite interesting. It's a kind of really interesting discussion, but I won't go into that. But I tend not to use a queen excluder, and the only time I use a queen excluder is because early on I was very sensibly advised by my then mentor to use mandies for honey, and so I've got a lot of brilliant big cell. I use this expression big cell because I keep my bees with small cell foundation. I've got big cell mandies, and I don't want ever to have any laying in there because I keep smaller bees. So because I've got these prized honey mandy frames, once I'm happy the brood nest is finished and I can see 1 or 2 boxes supers of honey, then I'll put a queen excluder on. So coming back to that basic point about once the brood's finished expanding, fine, then put your queen excluder, and then you can put your honey supers on.
Sorry, just scribbling loads of answers to myself. Okay, Richard, again, I think this one's been answered. How is the old queen replaced when there is no swarming or swarm cells to use?
Yeah,
you've answered that.
Yeah, so supersedure, and we find that we hang on to our queens, or rather the colony hangs on to the queens, and then when they decide, they will supersede. You know, not necessarily in the same year. Sometimes it'll be in the spring of the following year. Sometimes it'll be in the autumn, but they will supersede 1 for 1. And
you mark your queen so you know that she's gone.
We mark them. Yeah, I used to clip them. Now I don't clip them because I know they're not going. So I'm not worried about that.
Brave lad.
Maybe. Well, based on experience, you know, I think like a lot of things, like I said in the talk, we had to see the evidence of this with our own eyes. So that's why we did this frame by frame, very tedious inspections to see it. And once we were convinced, then you could sort of relax. And now we don't. We don't go in, we don't worry, we don't look. We do our bee disease inspection in the spring, we do that in the autumn. So we follow the MBU guidelines. but you know, that bit in between is just heaven. Is just heaven.
Interesting. Okay. Okay, another question here. Having right at the beginning, like December, winter, having a large area to be heated, is that detrimental to the bees? You suddenly put a big empty space on top of them.
Yeah, and I've been asked this lots of times, and you know, I've got, as I said, I've got this chap Chris who does it with Dadents. He does it with 2 Dadents. Sorry, he has his colony in a Daden, and then he has checkerboards a Daden above it. Massive colony. You know, that's bigger than 2 supers. And so I think, you know, I think it depends on your beekeeping regime. If you had any reservations about that, you could insulate your hive, you could put some Celotex, some good insulation on the top. What I did this year was interesting. I put some temperature probes in just to see what happened on different hives, on a checkerboarded hive, on a non-checkerboarded hive, on an insulated hive. What I found really interesting is the temperature. They will hold that temperature wherever the brood is. We all know this because the queen's laying, or the potential to lay, they'll hold that temperature very high, insulated or not. The temperature drops away massively as you go through the sort of checkerboarded frame. So far, we haven't had a problem. We haven't lost any colonies to freezing. As I say, I know people who've done it on double Dadents, which are massive. So I tend not to be too concerned about that.
That does make sense. Next one from Paul. Do the bees not just empty your checkerboarded supers with the honey frames in warm weather, like we've had warm weather recently? Are you going to find, is it important, the fact that your checkerboarded honey frames are going to get eaten?
What I've noticed is they will eat, but if they eat, they'll expand, you know. So before Christmas, when I was looking, I was surprised that, you know, as the MBU had said, you know, we'd had a really mild autumn, the reserves were low, the colonies were extra big, the checkerboarded colonies were extra big. So you're always going to get that, you know, mild weather, bees will expand. But then I found that, you know, they shrink down, they slow down, stop laying, as long as you're happy that they've got stores in there and that they can survive the winter. So I think this year was the first year I never ever put fondant on my colonies. I do on the nukes, but not on the colonies. This was the first year, because of that really mild autumn, that I've put fondant on in probably 5 or 6 years. So I'd like those diagrams: brood, fondant, checkerboarded, and then I might even put some fondant in a feeder eek above it. So I think, like all good kind of bee husbandry, you're going to be keeping an eye on the stores, keeping an eye on the bees, hefting. If they're light, you need to feed them, you know. And yeah.
Next one was, do you use a particular type of bee? What type of bee was being used?
Yeah, absolutely not. You know, I think my first colony was buckfast, then I tried carniolans. More recently, I just used mongrel bees. I don't think that there is any particular genetic disposition towards the success of this particular model for beekeeping. So my bees are mongrels, local bees, in other words. Other people I know will buy so-called buckfast bees. I think one person I know has got carniolans. So I don't think it's, you know, bee species is a relevant factor here for the success or otherwise.
Next question, I think you've answered, which was, do you check the brood for any signs of disease? You said yes, of course. You do your spring and your autumn. So you do no mid-season checks. You don't go into the brood at all in that period?
Very occasionally we might, and we're literally doing it just for the heck of it, you know, just for the heck of it. You know, what are the critical things to look for? You know, most of the time, I think by looking under the crown board, by looking at the entrance, you know, you've got a pretty good idea that there's something not right or everything's okay. But, you know, that comes with the experience. But for newer beekeepers, yes, you know, you want to do those, you want to follow the best practice, shall we say. and keep looking for things like disease. But I think, the guidelines are inspect in the spring, inspect in the autumn, and I'd always say do that. And if you ever go in between, then I probably would be looking for disease. But I think, long before you get anywhere near that colony, whether for most of the sort of seasoned beekeepers, whether there's something right or wrong, sorry, should I say. Yeah.
Okay, next one. How do you deal with, and what do you do with oilseed rape honey? Does it not seed everything else and set it all over the year?
I find that we are really lucky. We're in here, Pangbourne, west of Reading, and we've got oilseed rape. 3 years ago, we had oilseed rape. When they got rid of the neonics, the farmers around us stopped producing it, an oilseed rape. And I found that the bees, they wouldn't skip over brambles and other things to go to the oilseed rape. Other people I know, yes, you're going to get that spring influx, but typically when the oilseed rape is around, the colony is still in an expansive mode, and because these colonies are extra big, they're going up, 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 and they'll go through whatever you put there, whatever's there and has set. If their goal is to expand and expand rapidly, so sometimes I will put, if I've got old ivy honey, I will put that, use that, that's gone to, set rock hard, I will use that, and they will go through it and
Okay.
and expand their brood through it. So I don't get much oilseed rape. I wouldn't be too concerned if it was early on, but if we had a huge influx of oilseed rape, or one had a huge influx of oilseed rape, you'd have to make some provision for that. But in a healthy, strong, expanding colony, whether it's old ivy honey or oilseed rape, they'll deal with that.
So you could, if you discover those frames, you could just take those out and put those to one side, stick them in the freezer for a bit, whatever, and then those could form part of your collection of frames to checkerboard the following.
Absolutely,
December.
yeah, they would form part of the stores that alternate with the drawn empty comb. Absolutely.
I'm just writing that down, bear with me. Oh, December. Okay. Okay, next one. Are you doing queen rearing? And if so, what method do you use?
I've tried. We've as a group of us, small group of us, 10 of us that we're experimental beekeepers, and we've had quite a lot of goes at that, at queen rearing, using all the sort of tried and trusted methods. But now, what I tend to do with the checkerboarding, because as I said, you've got all the key ingredients, lots of bees, lots of resources. I tend to literally, and what I do personally is I keep all my bees in a really unusual way. So I only ever use one frame throughout, shallow frames, subject for another day. But I tend to narrow down her laying. So I isolate the queen into 3 boxes, then into a single box. So I know I haven't got to go looking for those larvae that are potential cell makers. And once I've had her there for 3 or 4 days, I will literally remove the queen, and then I'll use that huge colony to raise a few good queens. So when I say a few good queens, I'm only ever interested in maybe 6, 7, 8 queens. So I literally queen removal, but it's queen removal from a really strong ongoing colony with a narrowed down laying area. So I haven't got to hunt all through that monstrous colony looking for queen cells. And that works for me really well.
Interesting. Are you generally using double brood boxes below the start of your supers, or do you start from a single box?
I think, as I said, I keep mine in a slightly unusual way. So I only have one size box. So that's kind of not an issue for me. But if I was keeping mine on standard national brood boxes, and if we look at, you probably can't remember, but some of the pictures I showed of Walter Wright, he kind of moved in that direction. He started off with a single brood box. He tried double brood box, triple brood boxes. At that time, he was experimenting with the idea of space, just giving the bees more space, stop them swarming. It didn't. Reduced it, but didn't. But what he moved towards was, and that I favour, is have a single brood box, and after that, everything is a single size. And that single size can be either shallow boxes or standard national boxes, harder to extract from a standard national box. My friend, next door neighbour, Mark, he uses standard nationals throughout. So yeah, so in my case, I only have a single size box. If I was keeping bees more conventionally, I would probably have a double brood, I think, and then I'd use supers, but not worry about having laying in the queen laying in the supers.
Okay, thank you. Right, next one. How do you judge when to add your supers for honey and not brood?
So checking. So you need to check. So actually, all you need to do is, if we start at the top and do it a conventional way, you just go down, take a box off, and you can see at a glance where the bees are. Where the bees are doesn't necessarily tell you where the brood is, because they could either be busy laying eggs or they could be depositing nectar. But you don't even need to pull out a frame. If you pull out a box, look at it at the top, you can normally see, when you look into the central frames, you can normally see either at the top or the bottom, tilting it up, you can pretty much see, there's a bit of brood. As long as you can see brood, you leave them to keep going. Once you see the brood stop and you see the nectar start, you see boxes starting to fill with nectar, that's the point at which you can put your queen excluder on and then put on your honey supers.
Next one. For each new super, is that checkerboarded as well?
Yeah. So as I said early on, and I know it's difficult with a new concept. There's so much to take on, but you only do this once. So by doing it once, so let's say we've done it as we have done it. We've done it last month. We never have to do it again. What happens once you've done that is, over the winter and during January, during February, the bees are up and down. They've realized that they haven't got this block of honey. So you've already, as it were, changed their perception of what they need, their core requirements, that block of honey. Once you've done that, thereafter, the bees want a block of honey. What they would ideally like in nature, in a tree, is a block of honey at the top of their hive. If you've fractured that, checkerboarded it, and you keep moving the top of the hive up, so even though you've checkerboarded it, let's say the brood hasn't particularly expanded, but they've infilled the checkerboarding, as long as you've added empty boxes, we stay at least 2 boxes ahead of the bees, i.e. 2 boxes ahead of the brood or the nectar. Once you keep adding, as long as you keep adding those boxes, the ceiling's going up, going up, going up. So although they might infill along the way solid blocks, they're still thinking it's not what's at the top, which they have perceived, is still empty. And so keep going, keep ahead of them, and you won't have that experience of the swarming. As long as you stay ahead of them, you've changed their perception, you've removed the key ingredient, that honey reserve, and you stay ahead of them.
Okay, not sure if this is coming up, but a question from me. When you say you take off some capped supers and put them on another hive to keep them warm, are you shaking the bees off? Are you uniting it? Are you?
Yeah, so we're effectively almost like you're preparing for an extraction. So we would put a rhombus on or a porta bee, get the bees out, and then transfer that to maintain the humidity and temperature, so that basically it doesn't start setting.
So you just move it over at that point and plonk it on the top of a shorter stem.
Yeah, or if you're not so minded to extract immediately, then I just simply use another colony nearby as a storage medium for those for that honey, so that I can just do a single extraction.
Cool. Okay. Right then, with the high stack, which cells are sealed? Do the bees seal from below? If so, you can take off the sealed frames.
I'm not sure the question there.
No, let me, so with the high stack, do the bees seal from below? I think what he means is, I think the answer is yes, isn't it? I mean, they'll create their honey seal, and then you put the empties on top.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what he's asking then is you sort of take off the empty ones, slide out a full one, and drop the stack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Next one. When do you mark your queens?
If I get a new queen, I used to mark them as soon as they began. We're going away from checkerboarding here, but I used to mark them initially. As soon as I saw good evidence of laying, and I would say I lost maybe say 10% of my queens. Because I fiddled around with them, marked them, and at the time and clipped them. Now, if I have a queen 1 year, especially later on in the year, new queen, I will mark them at the same time. I would never clip them until once I see them laying, I would mark them. And I know it wasn't asked, but in terms of clipping, I'd wait till the spring. I would absolutely wait till the spring. And then with a much more settled colony that's been there a few months, I find that you lose less.
Okay, so Varroa control. Do you think using small cell would help reduce Varroa on the ground? In other words, what is your Varroa control with your sort of 2 inspection system?
So we've gone completely off piste here, but with small cell, I don't treat. I haven't treated for 11 years and it's bliss. I've got a box in my garage of the original 10 packs of Apiguard, and I don't treat. They have Varroa. Every colony in the Western world has Varroa, but the bees deal with it, and it's just heaven. It just opens up the autumn. I haven't got to worry about those temperature-reliant treatment methods. I haven't got to pour those chemicals. I'm not decimating all the ecology of the hive. I could talk for hours on this subject, but I don't, because of the small cell. And there's actually some evidence now from these amazing researchers in Norway, OT. Steve Martin's talked about it, Professor Steve Martin from Salford. It's just, for me, it's just bliss. And so easy. What's there to lose? You put in a different size foundation. The worst case is you treat. The best case is you don't have to treat. And how good is that? But I could go on for hours, as I say.
Where do you get your small cell foundation from?
Thorns.
Yeah.
Thorns sell it.
Yeah,
they will manufacture it, wired, unwired, any size, from shallow frames to Davins. You name it, they'll do it.
Okay. Next one. In a national hive, are you using national hives?
Yeah, let's say I am. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a no. In a national hive, how many supers would be given over at the brood nest peak?
Yeah.
So
it's a good question. It's a good question. I would say between 2 and 3 brood boxes. So I would say a double brood plus a super would probably contain the nest.
Okay. And then as you're having 2 empty supers all the time, so you're going to go 3 or 4 up above that.
Correct. Yeah.
You need a crane.
We don't do it if it's above head height now. We stop it, and because you're just managing the honey. Then after that, so you definitely don't. We don't go up ladders anymore.
That definitely sounds like a 2-person. I mean, hard to do that as a 1-person outfit.
Yeah, do you know, Ian? Before I did this, I had bigger stacks in a really good year with a regular hive. So those pictures are daunting. And when you see those skyscrapers that Walter Wright had, but we don't do that. It's myself, Anita, and Jill. They're not doing that. They're managing it on their own, on a regular basis. And we just don't. We moved away from those skyscrapers. So once you're confident the brood nest is finished, then you're just literally shuffling the supers off, and they're not going above head height.
So around about extraction time, everything should be roughly the same height, either your checkerboarded ones and the ones keeping it all warm.
Yeah, it depends. It depends what the others are doing. But I would say, we didn't do this for honey. We did it as a swarm prevention method. But the first year we did it, we had in a spring. I had in 10 years of beekeeping, I had 1 spring crop, and I think it was something like 38 pounds between 6 hives. In our first year of checkerboarding, we we were getting something like 110 pounds in spring from our colonies. It was, that wasn't why we were doing it. We were doing it to manage the swarm prevention. But, if honey's your thing, this is a no-brainer, really.
Okay, I think this one's been answered. Can full supers be extracted as we progress through the season to stop them getting high? You've already answered that, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, why use supers from the outset? Would it not be better to have 2 or even 3 brood boxes for the brood nest?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just a personal preference thing, and as I said, some people, some of us like to retain our boxes and frames for brood, and then others for honey, nectar and honey. So yeah, I think it's a personal preference thing. The fact that the bees hate empty space. Anytime you look in your brood box, they are trafficking that honey via the brood box. So, if we're worried about fecal contamination, quite a lot of our honey has already passed through the brood nest, but that's another discussion. But I think there's nothing wrong with, you just do it. We all do it individually to suit ourselves. So absolutely, if you prefer to keep your brood in brood boxes, traditional brood boxes, absolutely do that. Yeah.
Okay, next one. You said that you don't need to have tower block hives. How do you limit this? Is it by adding the queen excluder at the right moment?
Not really, no. So the queen excluder is very much an adjunct, really. It's by watching the brood nest. Once we know the brood nest has reached its limit, then thereafter we're into nectar management. The flow of managing the flow of nectar and the formation of honey. So once you get to that point, your queen excluder can go on. I'll probably give them one box, one super as a contingency, and then I'd put the queen excluder on. And it's quite easy to keep an eye on it each time you're going in and shuffling boxes of capped honey off. Then you can have a quick look. Just look below that queen excluder. Just make absolutely sure. So I'm not saying don't use a queen excluder. I'm just saying be quite careful about when you put it on, when the brood nest is finished and we can see an inflow of nectar.
Very clear explanation of how to start checkerboarding. Thank you. How do you transition from first to second year season, though? I think that means.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that because people think about these monstrous hives, colonies, brood nests, as well as all the nectar and honey. But when you get to the winter, I mean, honestly, my colonies now, you wouldn't know they're any different from anyone else's. They're very much, apart from the checkerboarding aspect, they shrink right down to a regular size colony. So it's surprising, but they go right down. When those queens reduce laying and the colony shrinks, then I would say they go right back down to a single brood box.
So once you've taken your supers off and you've still got your monster colony that's about to shrink, would that be a good time to pop on some boxes of foundation and feed, or use the autumn flow wherever, get some new drawn comb for the following season?
Yeah, I would tend to do my cone drawing, mid-season really. So while that flow is still going, that's such a fantastic time for drawing comb if you need it. And I tend to sometimes, because I have more than enough honey for me and friends and people who are interested in buying honey, I tend to use a colony for comb replacement, drawing comb, and use when we do have one, the summer flow for that. So I'm mindful about leaving things too late, whether it's queen rearing or making nukes or drawing comb. I try and do that mid-season when we're in a rich, not that we had one last season, but when the flow is good.
Does this work with national hives, or have you gone with the rose hive?
No, I've never used the rose hive. I loved that stuff that Tim, I forget his surname now, the conceiver of the rose hive. But I know people who've done it with 14 by 12s, nationals. Don't know anyone who's done it with the Langstroth Dadens. I don't think it matters. It's the principle. It's how you manipulate those stores. That's the key thing. It doesn't matter about I think the only thing that would be different is maybe if you were using a long hive, you know, a zest hive or a top bar hive, that would be a bit more tricky. But I mean, yeah, that would be an exception, I would suggest. But generally, I don't think it matters.
Okay, we've got 3 or 4 questions to go. Do you add the new checkerboard super on top or under the other supers?
The checkerboarded.
So that's right
box.
right at the beginning of the season.
Yeah. Well, we do the checkerboarding almost before the season. So if you like, the end of the winter, we do the checkerboarding, and then thereafter, if we're talking about, you know, bottom supering or top super, we just add boxes on top. You know, we don't slide things underneath. I don't think it makes any difference. I think it's quite interesting when you watch bees. You know, once they start filling a box with nectar, you can do what you like with that box. You can put it at the top, you can put it at the bottom. They will find it and carry on filling it. So we just tend to add on, and then if we have full capped honey, we'll slide that out and then let everything drop and add on again. So as long as we've got a couple of boxes empty of bees, empty of either brood and or nectar, 2 boxes, then we feel right, we've got a contingency.
I think I'd have to extract as we're going along and run out of kit. When you remove honey boxes and put on another colony, is that a normal colony or a checkerboarded colony?
Yeah, I tend to use a non-checkerboarded colony because I don't want that. You know, I don't want to have to manage that as well. So they tend to tick over more slowly. A non-checkerboarded colony or a different kind of colony. I keep top entrance hives. They tick over really slowly. So it's a great vehicle for hanging on to honey and just retaining it. But it tends to be non-checkerboarded hives. I usually keep one that's non-checkerboarded just for that sole purpose of storing capped honey as a reserve, as a sort of a larder for extraction.
Okay, thank you. Next one. In the autumn, are you driving the bees into one brood box?
Yeah, no, I tend to just leave them to do their own thing, you know, and like all of our colonies, they will naturally shrink, you know, and some of them shrink more quickly than others, but I don't feel I've ever had to kind of force that. I just see them shrinking very quickly. So yeah, it doesn't tend to be an issue. It tends to be something that happens naturally.
Well, you've got other options, of course, haven't you? You can make up some overwintered nukes out of brood and honey and whatever.
Yeah, I'm always worried about doing that. You know, I've been bitten so many times by wasps. You know, if you have a really good year for wasps, then your nukes can be decimated. They need that time to settle down and develop that kind of cohesion. So I don't do that. And once I get beyond June, I'm nervous of doing that. I've come unstuck. You know, I've lost 6, 7 nukes in one go. So I tend not to do that personally. But maybe I'm not very good at it, and that's why they don't survive later on.
That just sounds like you've got a lot of wasps around your way. Yeah. Okay, let's go. Can you add an upper access for the foragers when you've got a stack?
You can do. You know, I'm always a bit mindful of that. I mean, it's fine. You know, with strong colonies and alongside strong colonies, you can do. I don't do that myself. I just kind of let them carry on doing their own thing the way they would normally. I think you could. I've never done it. You know, I've got some top entrance hives. That's a different kind of way of keeping bees all together. But they have a single entrance at the top. But the regular colonies, yeah, I can't really make an informed opinion on that.
I think you could possibly get away with it, but then close it off as soon as the flow stops. Otherwise, robbing and Okay, last couple. Checkerboarding sort of implies that each box is at right angles to the one underneath. Please confirm that is not the way to do it.
Yeah, I confirm that's not the way to do it. All the frames are directly in alignment, the regular way that, you know, the They're all they're either cold or warm facing, all of them one way. Yeah.
Okay, and so far, unless anybody wants to quickly type in another one, this will be the last one. Do you just assume they manage their queen and any supersedure without visually confirming?
Yeah, so as I said, when we went, the first year we did this, and a little bit in the second year, we were going in frame by frame. So, you know, we had some magical moments when we could see things like supersedure. So we saw the evidence of our own eyes. We saw one colony, colossal colony, you know, skyscraper at this stage. We hadn't realized that you can actually do it a slightly different way without the skyscraper effect. Went down and we could see, you know, the supersedure, 2 supersedure cells in one colony. And because of our interfering, pure accident, you know, by pulling the boxes apart, we broke one of them. And fortunately, there was another one, so they made do with that. So I have seen that, and we know that we know that they replace one for one. So yeah, I think I can faithfully say we've seen the evidence of that, and we know that our queens haven't swarmed in between.
So give us a clue then. So we're going to do an end of season disease inspection, yeah, before settling them down. Ludovic, how long do you wait then? So the supers are off. You want the brood nest to shrink a bit. Yeah. At what stage would you go in and do your second disease inspection of the year?
Personally, I would do it, you know, as soon as the honey's off, I would do it sometime thereafter. So in my case, I don't have to worry about the varroa. So, you know, we all get a bit kind of a bit sensitive to that, because quite rightly so, because it's, you know, the biggest thing that's going to hurt our colonies. But as they're shrinking, you know, I quite like to see, with a largish colony, I quite like to see that big volume of brood, so you can see the obvious things. What are the obvious things we're looking for are varroa, I think increasingly chronic bee paralysis, sac brood, chalk brood. I tend to see a little bit of everything except AFB and EFB, English foul brood, American foul brood. I see a little bit of sac brood, a little bit of chalk brood, especially early in the year. They seem to deal with that, and once they get going later in the year, to come back to your question, I like to have a fairly significant sized brood so that I can actually, you know, go across that and see what I can see, you know, whether it's chalk brood or uncapped brood, or, you know, and looking for the big ticket items, AFB and EFB. So I personally like to do it with a fairly, you know, pretty soon after I've taken off the honey.
If you had sick bees, you're not going to get a successful stack anyway. So you should get a bit of a clue through the season if it's not going up as you are planning.
Yeah, and as I said, I think you can tell an awful lot. You'll see things like chronic bee paralysis by just lifting the crown board or looking at the entrance. You know, you'll see the evidence of varroa, you know, on your drop boards. You know, what else is there in there that's going to really decimate that colony? It'll be, you know, real unforgivers like EFB and AFB, which are rare, thankfully, very rare. And I think the other sort of minor brood diseases, yeah, well, there are other things like wax moth. I tend not to get too much of that with the small cell bees. And so, yeah, generally, I've maybe been really lucky, but I tend not to have too much to worry about. But I do pay attention, you know, to them, the bees, yeah.
Okay, fine. Someone just thrown in the last question. Could you just recap how you get over the high stacks?
So once the brood nest has finished expanding, and we know it's finished expanding because suddenly when we go looking from the top down, we'll hit either bees with a nest with eggs, larvae, or capped brood, or we'll start to hit nectar. So once we see nectar, we would allow them to fill that box, maybe add another super as a contingency, might put on a queen excluder at this point. So once we know that's the case, right, we actually know mentally and in our notes, we know where the brood nest is, we know where the first full box of nectar, potentially nectar and honey is. We add a couple of supers, and then we check that every so often. You lift the first box off, the second box off. You can see, oh, it's getting heavy. These are getting really heavy. Add some more. So we might have a stack, but the top two are probably empty. Take those off, and then I'd probably go down to the box that's above the brood and take that. And if there's more than one capped honey box, take that, and maybe the one above it, if it's capped, drop the whole thing down. So you're kind of managing that area above the brood where there's nectar only, and just extracting those boxes. And in that way, you know, you're not having to go up a set of steps, and that seems to work.
Yeah, steps sound dangerous. So yeah, that
Steps are, yeah, they are, yeah, for sure.
Right then, that we have come to the end of our list of questions. John, thank you. I'm just going to hand over to Richard.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, John. That was, got to say, that's fascinating. It sounds complicated.
Yeah, I think what's complicated, Richard, is the dynamics of what goes on in the hive. If we, as I said at the beginning, you know, if we stopped at slide 3, which is you take that box of stores and just fracture that above the bees, and then just stay ahead of them, and do it early, and that's it. You know, it's if you want to scratch beneath the surface and try and understand it, you know, read our book or read Walter Wright's writings on bee source. But it took us a long time, I have to say, because of the way Walter Wright writes. It took us a long time to get our heads around how to do this and what's happening. 2 or 3 seasons into it, it's a dream. You know, it's so easy and it's so minimalist, and there's no going into the brood. So I think maybe it's worth you know, exploring and trying it maybe on a colony just to see if it works.
Yeah, I can see once you're into it, and you require a lot more kit as well, I suspect, than when you're normally keeping your colonies together. I didn't quite understand how you're on top of Varroa. This year has been a particularly bad year for Varroa, and are you still Varroa free? Well,
no, I don't treat, and I can sell my small cell nukes. You know, I can never produce enough of them, and because I keep them with the small cell foundation, you know, and you have to read. I mean, I've written a couple of articles in BKA News about chemical-free beekeeping using small cell and using the smaller cell bee. I think what's really interesting, you know, some of us might have heard about what's happening in Blenheim Palace at the moment with this amazing discovery of Apis mellifera. And the chap who's doing that, Philippe Solbany, I'm coming back to your point, absolutely. You know, he said they're native British black bee, and they've done the genetics. Hasn't published it yet, but they've done the genetics. And found that they are. But what's really interesting is they're all small bees. They're small cell bees. They're smaller, 10% smaller than our regular bees. Their cell size is 4.7 to 5.1. We keep our bees on 5.4 mil foundation. These smaller bees seem to have a higher propensity for dealing with the Varroa. Something kicks in genetically with them. So I don't treat, you know, as I say, I don't treat, and it's great. It doesn't matter about what's going on out there in terms of Varroa loads. And early on, I didn't have mine in a desert of Varroa. I always kept a big cell untreated colony right by them. I wanted that drift. I wanted those drones. I thought they've got to be able to tough it out, and for me, you know, it works. And for many others, I won't, but I could name seasonal bee inspectors who keep them on small cell, but they can't talk about that too much because that's not kind of the MBU's party line on that. But it works. It works for me and a small minority of people.
It sounds like subject for perhaps another talk.
Could be.
Yeah. We might come back to you on that one, John.
Sure.
Anyway, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. It was, far more fascinating than I thought it was going to be. So thank you very much. And on behalf of everybody here, I'd just like to say thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Perhaps look forward to seeing you up in Cheltenham at some point.
Thank you.
If anybody saw Jenny Wilkinson holding it up, this is because he doesn't like to plug his own book. There's his book. Yeah, it's so most of the slides I think are actually in here, aren't they?
A lot of them are, yeah. And as I say, you know, if you're really interested, all of Walter Wright's original teachings are on Bsource, all of his original publications. That booklet is available on Amazon and Northern Bee Books. And I think the value in the book is it mercifully simplifies it. You know, it's mainly pictures and diagrams and photos, less words, you know, less to get one's head round. I'm not patronizing anybody, but I think less is more sometimes with these things. So if you have any questions, feel free to, you know, email me. I'm very approachable.
John, it's excellent. I actually made a note to actually plan to keep back some supers, and I'm going to be giving this a go on a few hives next year. So excellent. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I think everybody's done. Lots of messages saying thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
We've kept the numbers up all night. No drop off.
Hey.
Which is always a good sign.
Yeah.
Always
Thank
a good
you.
sign. Thank you for listening.